June 4th, 1943. Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. For Unteroffizier Herman Butcher, the solid ground of America felt strangely treacherous. The ghost of the Atlantic still swayed in his legs after 14 days at sea, but it was his eyes that he couldn't trust. He gripped the ship's railing, knuckles white, and stared at a scene that logic dictated could not exist. It wasn't a land ravaged by war. It was a land that seemed to have forgotten a war was even happening. The air didn't smell of cordite and fear, but of roasted coffee and, impossibly, sweet fried dough from a vendor's cart near the pier. There was no shriek of air raid sirens, but the distant, jaunty rhythm of a brass band playing a popular tune he didn't recognize. 3 years of Nazi propaganda, 3 years of hearing about a decadent, chaotic America on the brink of collapse, evaporated in the hazy Virginia morning. He saw dock workers, black and white, operating side by side with a casual efficiency that defied the rigid racial laws of his homeland. They moved with a purpose, guiding colossal cranes that seemed stolen from a future century, unloading ship after ship in a relentless, unhurried ballet of industrial might. Women in coveralls, their hair tied up in kerchiefs, confidently operated machinery that would have been reserved for specialized male engineers in Germany. Children hawked newspapers at the gates, their calls mixing with the music. No one scattered. No one even flinched at the sight of the grey-green uniforms of the Wehrmacht. He turned to the man behind him, another veteran of Rommel's vaunted Afrika Corps, his face a mask of disbelief. "Die, Spinnen. Die, Amies," Butcher whispered, the words catching in his throat. "The Americans. They're insane." It wasn't an insult. It was a surrender to a reality so profoundly alien it felt like madness. This story isn't about American abundance. That tale has been told. It's about a far more subversive weapon, one for which the Third Reich had no countermeasure: American normalcy. This is the story of how a nation at war won a second, silent war, not on the battlefield, but in the minds of its captives. It's about a society so secure, so breathtakingly confident in its own power, that it treated its mortal enemies not with hatred, but with a bewildering, disarming, and ultimately destructive form of hospitality. It was a psychological campaign waged not with pamphlets, but with penicillin, coffee, and the simple, devastating act of human decency. The processing at Norfolk began the systematic unraveling of their worldview. This was what Butcher would later call the first impossibility. German military doctrine, practiced from the frozen fields of Russia to the blistering sands of Africa, viewed prisoners through one of two lenses: assets to be brutally exploited, or burdens to be ruthlessly minimized. The Geneva Convention was a document of convenience, a suggestion to be acknowledged only when it served a purpose. Yet here, an American captain stood before them, speaking their language with a flat, Midwestern accent that made the fluent German all the more surreal. He wasn't shouting orders, he was explaining rights. He methodically read articles from the Geneva Convention, clarifying rules about labor, correspondence, and treatment. Then he asked if there were any dietary restrictions. The question hung in the air, thick with absurdity. In the midst of this came the second impossibility. A sergeant, his surname clearly Jewish, moved down the line with Red Cross personnel, handing out comfort packages. He explained, in patient German, that kosher meals could be arranged for any Jewish prisoners among them. A few Wehrmacht soldiers let out nervous, choked laughs. This had to be a joke, a cruel piece of American mockery. It wasn't. The American military, in the midst of a global war against an anti-Semitic regime, had made logistical preparations for the religious dietary needs of its enemies. The laughter died, replaced by a confused, uneasy silence. The medical inspections defied all military logic. German soldiers, wounded by American bullets and shrapnel, were triaged with the same urgency as Allied casualties. They received penicillin, the miracle drug, the sacred gold that was barely available in Germany's most advanced field hospitals. Guy Matthey, an inspector from the Swiss Red Cross, would later write in his July 1943 report, "The medical treatment afforded to German prisoners of war equals, and in some instances exceeds that which is given to American military personnel." prisoners with infected wounds, men who would have faced amputation or a slow death on the Eastern Front, watched in disbelief as their fevers broke and their lives were saved by the very nation they had sought to destroy. And then came the most profound violation of the natural order of war. An African-American medical technician, a corporal, moved through the line of Wehrmacht officers, drawing blood for routine health screenings. In Germany, this act was not just a breach of protocol, it was a crime, a Rassenschande, a defilement of the race. Here, it was simply Tuesday. Butcher watched his superiors, men who believed themselves to be the pinnacle of Aryan evolution, sit with rigid backs and clenched jaws, submitting to the authority and medical expertise of a man their ideology deemed subhuman. The technician was professional, efficient, and utterly indifferent to the existential crisis unfolding in the minds of his patients. The final shock of the day came in the mess hall. They were led into a vast chamber filled with the clatter of cutlery and the low hum of hundreds of conversations. At one end of the hall, American sailors were eating. The German prisoners were directed to the other. They were enemies. Weeks ago, these same groups of men had been hunting each other in the lethal chess match of Atlantic convoy battles. Now, they stood in the same food lines, received the same generous portions of roast beef and potatoes, and sat in the same hall. Butcher watched the Americans. He expected taunts, glares, perhaps a show of triumphant animosity. He saw none. The sailors were more interested in the crackling broadcast of a baseball game on the radio, arguing about plays and players whose names meant nothing to the Germans. They paid almost no attention to the 2,500 defeated enemies sitting just 50 feet away. This wasn't kindness. This was something far more unsettling. It was indifference, an indifference born not of ignorance, but of an absolute, unshakable confidence. It was the indifference of a giant who doesn't concern himself with the ants at his feet. In that moment, surrounded by the mundane reality of an American dinner, Herman Butcher felt the first true tremor of defeat. A defeat not of arms, but of ideals. If Norfolk was a confusing prologue, the train journey into the American interior was the bewildering first chapter of a new, terrifying book. In Germany, prisoner movements were clandestine affairs, conducted in sealed boxcars under the cloak of night, to hide the realities of war from civilians and the realities of the homeland from the prisoners. The American approach was radically, dangerously different. They were loaded onto passenger trains, not cattle cars reeking of livestock, but cushioned coaches with glass windows that offered panoramic views of the passing continent. It felt less like a prisoner transfer and more like a perverse sightseeing tour arranged by a captor with nothing to hide. As the trains rumbled westward, they didn't bypass the industrial centers. They went straight through them. This was no accident. It was a calculated display of logistical arrogance. They passed sprawling factory complexes in Pennsylvania and Ohio that stretched for miles, their smokestacks belching thick grey plumes into the sky 24 hours a day. These were not the camouflaged, heavily guarded bunkers of the Ruhr Valley, desperately trying to hide from Allied bombers. These were colossal brazen temples of industry, operating in the open, their names painted in letters 30 feet high on the sides of buildings. At a stop near Baltimore, the train idled next to the Glenn L. Martin aircraft plant. Butcher pressed his face to the glass, counting. Row after row of B-26 Marauder bombers sat on the tarmac, gleaming in the sun, waiting for delivery. He stopped counting at 50. In Germany, a dozen new aircraft would be a fiercely guarded state secret. Here, they were just inventory, sitting out like cars at a dealership. It was a staggering realization. America wasn't just outproducing Germany. It was doing so with such overwhelming volume that secrecy had become irrelevant. But it wasn't just the scale of industry that chipped away at their resolve. It was the shocking, casual wealth of the ordinary people. In Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the train stopped during a shift change at a steel mill. German officers, men who had commanded battalions, watched in stunned silence as American workers exited the gates. They weren't the haggard, overworked slave laborers they might have seen in occupied territories. These men wore sturdy leather boots, checked the time on wristwatches, and carried metal lunchboxes. Many climbed into their own personal automobiles to drive home. Then, a moment so trivial it wouldn't even register to an American observer. Yet it struck the watching Germans with the force of a physical blow. A young worker, laughing with a friend, took a bite from a bright red apple, made a face as if it was slightly bruised, and casually tossed half of it into a trash can before pulling a fresh one from his lunchbox. Inside the train car, a collective gasp rippled through the prisoners. Men who had fought fiercely over mouldy crusts of bread in the deserts of Tunisia stared at the discarded fruit. That half-eaten apple became a symbol more potent than any propaganda poster. It represented a society so awash in abundance that waste was a casual, thoughtless act. If the lowest worker could throw away food, what hope did Germany have of starving this nation into submission? The journey continued, a relentless parade of psychological blows. They passed through small towns where individual houses sat on their own plots of land, not crowded tenements. Each house had a garden, not for desperate subsistence farming, but for flowers. Electric lights burned in every window, even late at night, a reckless disregard for energy conservation that would be criminal in Berlin. Forests of radio antennas sprouted from rooftops, a testament to a widely informed, or at least widely entertained, populace. The most surreal stop came at Union Station in Washington, D.C. The prisoner train paused on a track adjacent to standard civilian platforms. Through the windows, they watched the heart of the enemy capital. It was a scene of chaotic, vibrant life. They saw soldiers kissing their sweethearts goodbye, mothers wiping away tears, children waving small American flags. But they also saw teenagers in bright clothes drinking milkshakes at a station counter, businessmen reading newspapers with headlines openly critical of war strategies. They were mere feet away from the people they had sworn to kill, separated only by glass and a few bored-looking MPs who seemed more interested in directing pedestrian traffic than guarding dangerous Nazis. There was no fear in the eyes of the civilians who glanced at the train. There was curiosity, perhaps a little pity, but no terror. This realization was perhaps the hardest to swallow. To the average American, these supermen of the Third Reich were now just a passing curiosity, already neutralized, already irrelevant to their daily lives. The train pulled away, leaving the prisoners with a sinking, terrifying certainty. They had not just been defeated, they had been trivialized. The train finally hissed to a stop in what felt like the middle of nowhere. Outside the windows, there was nothing but a vast, bleached sky emptiness and the shimmering heat rising from the Texas plains. This, Herman Butcher thought, must be what the end of the world looked like. They were marched from the station, their boots kicking up clouds of fine red dust, towards a sprawling compound surrounded by barbed wire. It was the only familiar sight they had seen in days, but as they passed through the gates of Camp Hearn, the familiarity ended. This was no Stalag. There were no grim, concrete blockhouses or muddy, disease-ridden trenches. Instead, it looked like a hastily constructed American town. Orderly rows of simple wooden barracks were laid out along graded dirt roads. It was Spartan, but it was clean. It was organized. There was a sense of impermanent, yet undeniable civilization. The true shock came when they were assigned to their barracks. Butcher stepped inside, bracing himself for the familiar stench of unwashed bodies, straw pallets, and a single cold water tap for 100 men. Instead, he stopped dead in the doorway. The building was filled with rows of individual beds, not bunks, but beds, each with its own mattress, a set of clean sheets, and a neatly folded blanket. At the foot of each bed was a personal footlocker. This wasn't just better than a prison camp. For many of the enlisted men, farm boys, and factory workers from rural Germany, it was a standard of living that surpassed the homes they had left behind. And then he saw it. At the end of the barracks was a separate room with rows of porcelain flush toilets and sinks with taps for both hot and cold water. Hot water, on demand, for prisoners of war. It was an act of such extravagant, pointless luxury that it bordered on the insane. Germany was melting down its church bells for copper. America was heating water for its enemies to wash their faces. Their disorientation deepened when they were assembled to hear from the camp commander, Lieutenant Colonel Cecile Stiles. He was a tall, lean Texan who looked more like a friendly schoolteacher than a military warden. He stood before them, not on a raised platform, but on their level, and addressed them in slow, careful, but grammatically correct German. He explained the camp rules: no escape attempts, daily roll calls, lights out at 10, standard procedure. But then he said something that shattered their understanding of the captor-captive relationship. He informed them that, within the confines of the compounds, they would largely govern themselves. They would elect their own barracks, leaders, and camp spokesmen. They would organize their own recreational activities, manage their own daily schedules, and even publish their own camp newspaper, subject to censorship. A wave of murmurs spread through the German ranks. What was this? Was it a trick? A sophisticated form of psychological torture designed to make them reveal their own internal command structure and identify the natural leaders? Or was it, impossibly, a sign of weakness, a naive belief that enemies, given a taste of freedom, would simply behave? The military mind, trained in a rigid hierarchy of command and obey, could not process this. To grant autonomy to the enemy was to invite chaos. It was a fundamental violation of the principles of control. They were being given responsibility, a burden they found far more unsettling than brutality. But the most potent weapon in Camp Hearn's psychological arsenal was not the hot water or the self-governance. It was a small, unassuming wooden building near the center of the camp. The canteen. This was a store, a shop where prisoners could spend the scrip they earned from voluntary labor, 80 cents a day, the same base pay as an American private. Inside was a universe of small, forgotten luxuries. Cigarettes of multiple brands, bars of Hershey's chocolate, tins of tobacco, Lifebuoy soap, bottles of Coca-Cola, stationery, pencils, and even musical instruments like harmonicas and guitars. The War Department had authorized this, believing that providing small comforts would maintain morale and discourage dissent. They had no idea they were funding a masterclass in capitalist ideology. The Nazi state had told them what to think, what to read, what to hate. Their lives had been a relentless march of collective duty and prescribed action. Here, they were faced with a decision that was simultaneously trivial and profound. Should I spend my scrip on a pack of Lucky Strikes or a bar of chocolate? Should I write a letter home or save up for a new harmonica? It was a small, almost meaningless act of self-determination, but it was an act nonetheless. For the first time in years, they were being treated not as a faceless collective, but as individuals with personal preferences. The simple choice between a sweet and a smoke was a more powerful lesson in American values than any lecture could ever be. That evening, lying on his mattress, his own personal mattress, Herman Butcher stared at the electric light bulb burning steadily overhead. He thought of the barbed wire fence outside. He was beginning to understand. The Americans hadn't built a prison. They had built a gilded cage, and he was terrified to realize that the most dangerous bars weren't the ones made of steel and wire, but the ones forged from comfort, choice, and a bewildering, inexplicable kindness. The gilded cage of Camp Hearn was merely the prelude. The real war for the soul began when the prisoners were put to work. A severe labor shortage in Texas prompted the War Manpower Commission to authorize the use of POW labor in agriculture and other non-military industries. For the men of the Wehrmacht, this was the moment they had been trained for, a chance to sabotage the enemy's war machine from within. But the America they encountered in the cotton fields and canning factories of Texas was a weaponized paradox, a place that systematically dismantled their certainties, not with force, but with baffling complexity. Their first true ideological test came at the legendary King Ranch, an empire of cattle and grass larger than the state of Rhode Island. Here, German soldiers, indoctrinated with the gospel of Aryan supremacy, found themselves working shoulder to shoulder with Mexican-American vaqueros and African-American ranch hands. Nazi racial theory was a simple, brutal pyramid with the Aryan at its apex. American reality was a messy, confusing, and unexpectedly efficient tangle. They watched in grudging admiration as the vaqueros, men of a supposedly inferior mixed race, handled horses with an artistry that no German cavalryman could match. They saw black laborers work with a relentless stamina under the punishing Texas sun, often outperforming the Germans who considered themselves physically superior. The ranch foreman, Richard Kleberg Jr., judged men not by the color of their skin, but by the work of their hands. Efficiency, not ethnicity, was the ruling principle. This daily, practical demonstration that a multiracial workforce could be not just functional, but highly effective, was a quiet poison seeping into the foundations of their worldview. The ultimate racial paradox, however, unfolded during their supervised trips into the town of Herne. After a long day's work, a German POW could walk into a drugstore, sit at the counter, and be served a cold Coca-Cola. Yet, the black American soldier who guarded him, a citizen of this country wearing its uniform, would be refused service at that same counter. German enemies were, in some contexts, afforded more social privilege than American citizens. This was a profoundly disturbing realization. It was a hypocrisy so stark it forced a terrible question. If America could be so powerful and prosperous while being so inconsistent and impure in its racial logic, then was the entire Nazi ideology of racial purity not just morally bankrupt, but fundamentally wrong about the very nature of national strength. It presented a truth that was both damning of America's own injustices and utterly devastating to the Nazi creed. The second front in this silent war was the shocking spectacle of American free speech. In Germany, a careless word against the Führer could mean a visit from the Gestapo and a one-way trip to a concentration camp. In the fields of Texas, German prisoners listened, dumbfounded, as American farmers openly, loudly, and profanely cursed President Franklin D. Roosevelt. They complained about government price controls, griped about fuel rationing, and called federal inspectors idiots. Butcher's memoir details one unforgettable incident at a farm near Bryan. The farmer, a man in his 60s, got into a shouting match with an inspector from the Department of Agriculture over crop allocations. The argument escalated until the farmer, red-faced and shaking with rage, told the federal official to go to hell and get off his property. The German prisoners braced for the inevitable, the arrest, the punishment. Nothing happened. The inspector simply got in his car and drove away, defeated. The farmer went back to work, still grumbling. To the Germans, this was an act of political suicide. To the Americans, it was just another Wednesday. This casual defiance of authority, this belief that a common citizen could challenge the state and suffer no consequences, was more alien than any piece of technology they had seen. It suggested that the state was not an all-powerful entity to be feared and obeyed, but a servant of the people, subject to their anger and criticism. The final, most sophisticated assault was the re-education program, cleverly disguised as voluntary education. The camp library became the main battlefield. Initially stocked with donations, it soon received thousands of volumes from the American Library Association. Crucially, this included books by authors banned and burned by the Nazis. A German soldier could walk into the library at Camp Herne and check out a copy of Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, a book that would have earned him a death sentence in Germany. He could read the works of Thomas Mann, Stefan Zweig, and Jewish authors like Lion Feuchtwanger. The camp even published its own newspaper, Der Spiegel, the Mirror. Early editions, written and edited by ardent Nazi officers, were filled with predictable propaganda. But the American camp administrators, in a stroke of psychological genius, did not shut it down. They simply made more paper and ink available, and encouraged the anti-Nazi and non-political factions to start writing. Slowly, articles questioning the war began to appear. Debates about Germany's future broke out in the opinion columns. The newspaper became a true mirror, reflecting the fracturing of the prisoners' ideological unity. This was the silent war in its purest form. America was defeating Nazism not by banning its ideas, but by overwhelming them. It offered a better, more compelling alternative. It didn't need to burn books, because it was confident that in a free marketplace of ideas, the truth would ultimately win. For Herman Butcher and thousands like him, the cotton fields of Texas became the graveyard of their old beliefs, and the camp library became the nursery for a new, fragile, and terrifying idea, the idea of freedom. By December 1943, the German prisoners at Camp Herne were men adrift. The ideological anchors that had moored them for a decade had been systematically severed. They had witnessed American industrial power, personal abundance, racial complexity, and political freedom. Each observation was a crack in the foundation of their worldview, but it was the Christmas of 1943 that brought the entire structure crashing down. It was an offensive of kindness so overwhelming, so strategically devastating, that it broke the last vestiges of their psychological resistance. The campaign began with the local newspaper, the Herne Democrat. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, it ran articles not about hating the enemy, but about a community-wide effort to provide a proper Christmas for the German prisoners. This wasn't a military initiative, it was a civilian one. The people of Herne, Texas, a town with a population of just over 2,000 souls, many of whom had sons, brothers, and husbands fighting and dying overseas, decided to mobilize, not for revenge, but for charity. The prisoners read the articles with a mixture of suspicion and disbelief. Was this another form of American propaganda? A trick to lull them into a false sense of security. But then the donations began to arrive at the camp gates. Local churches organized drives to collect 4,800 individual gift packages, one for every prisoner. School children, who were being taught in class about the evils of the Third Reich, spent their afternoons creating handmade Christmas cards with crayon drawings of angels and Christmas trees. The most incomprehensible act of generosity came from American Legion Post 164. This was an organization of World War I veterans, men who had fought and bled against the German army in the trenches of France. These very men, who had every reason to despise the uniform their prisoners wore, donated cigarettes, candy, and sports equipment to their former enemies' successors. It was an act that defied all logic of warfare and tribal hatred. On Christmas Eve, the main compound of Camp Herne was transformed. The camp Christmas tree, a 30-foot pine donated by the local Lions Club, blazed with hundreds of electric lights that burned through the night, a stunning display of energy extravagance to men from a blacked-out continent. That evening, a convoy of church buses pulled up to the camp. Inside were the choirs from several local churches. They had come to sing Christmas carols for the prisoners. In German, Mrs. Sarah Patterson, the choir director of the First Methodist Church, had spent weeks teaching her congregation the phonetic pronunciation of Still Nacht, silent night. Her own son, a young man of 20, was at that very moment serving in the brutal Italian campaign, fighting his way up a frozen peninsula against fierce German resistance. The prisoners were assembled in the recreation hall. As the familiar, haunting melody of Stille Nacht filled the room, sung with earnest, heavily accented German by the mothers, wives, and sisters of their enemies, the dam of military stoicism finally broke. Hermann Butcher watched as hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had witnessed unspeakable horrors without flinching, began to weep. They cried silently at first, then with great, shuddering sobs. The cognitive dissonance was too much to bear. The mothers of the men they were supposed to kill were singing them lullabies of peace. It was in that moment he understood. This wasn't weakness. This was a demonstration of a power so profound, so unshakably confident, it had no need for hatred. The emotional onslaught continued on Christmas Day. The feast they were served was a thing of legend, its menu meticulously preserved in quartermaster records. It wasn't just a meal, it was a statement. Each man received a full pound of roast turkey, slices of ham, candied sweet potatoes, green beans, cornbread stuffing, cranberry sauce, and a choice of mince or apple pie. There was ice cream for dessert, beer was provided for enlisted men, and California wine for the officers. The meal was estimated to total over 5,000 calories per man. As they ate, the prisoners thought of their families back home. They knew from letters that German civilian rations were now below 1,200 calories a day. A slow starvation diet. Their loved ones were scrounging for potatoes and turnips in the rubble of bombed-out cities, while they, the defeated enemy, were feasting like kings in the heart of the nation that was destroying their homeland. In his memoir, Butcher described this as the turning point, the moment of his complete ideological surrender. He wrote, "We had been taught that history is a struggle of blood and iron, that the strong must dominate the weak. But these people, whose sons we had tried to kill, gave us gifts. Their kindness was not a weakness, but a strength so absolute it felt like a force of nature. It was the confidence of a people who knew they had already won not just the war, but the peace that would follow." The Christmas of 1943 at Camp Hearn wasn't just a holiday celebration. It was the final decisive battle in the silent war for the German soul. And it was won not with bullets or bombs, but with Christmas carols, chocolate, and an act of radical humanity that proved more destructive to Nazi ideology than any battlefield defeat. America hadn't just captured their bodies, it had conquered their minds. The end of the war in Europe in May 1945 did not end the story for the German prisoners in America. It began the final, most crucial chapter. As Germany lay in ruins, a nation shattered physically and morally, the American government initiated a quiet, ambitious project. They began preparing their 425,000 German captives not just for repatriation, but for reconstruction. This wasn't merely about sending men home. It was about sending apostles of a new way of thinking back to the heart of a broken continent. The Special Projects Division, the same office that had overseen the subtle re-education programs, now ramped up its efforts. Courses in civil administration, public health, agricultural modernization, and democratic governance were offered in the camps. The prisoners were shown films of the liberated concentration camps, the raw, undeniable evidence of the depravity of the regime they had served. But these images were not shown to inspire guilt, but to instill purpose, the purpose of ensuring that such a thing could never happen again. The stories of the men who passed through camps like Hearn became the living testament to this unprecedented strategy. Hermann Butcher, the cynical Unteroffizier who arrived convinced of American insanity, was one of the 5,000 former POWs who applied for and were granted permission to immigrate to the United States in the 1950 seconds. He became a citizen, raised a family, and worked for 30 years as a successful engineer for General Motors, contributing to the very industrial might that had once overwhelmed him. Then there was the strange case of Georg Gärtner. Fearing he would be handed over to the Soviets, he escaped from a camp in New Mexico just after the war. But he didn't flee the country. Instead, he vanished into America itself. For 40 years, he lived under an assumed name, Dennis Wiles, marrying an American woman, raising children, and working as a tennis instructor. He chose a life as an illegal alien in the country of his former enemies over a return to his homeland. When he finally surrendered in 1985, he was an American in all but paper, a man so thoroughly transformed by the society he had infiltrated that he could no longer imagine leaving it. The statistics tell a story just as powerful as the anecdotes. Of the 425,000 prisoners, there were only a minuscule number of escape attempts and virtually no incidents of sabotage. But more importantly, when these men returned to Germany, they carried the seeds of democracy with them. Occupation records reveal that thousands of former POWs who had been held in America became instrumental in building the new West German state. 48 became members of the Bundestag, the German parliament. Over 300 served as mayors. Thousands more became teachers, police officers, and business managers, applying the principles of efficiency, pragmatism, and democratic cooperation they had witnessed firsthand. They had been sent to America as soldiers of the Third Reich. They returned as the founding fathers of the German Federal Republic. In 1984, on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, a group of 50 former prisoners returned to Hearn, Texas. The town welcomed them with a barbecue. Grey-haired Wehrmacht veterans embraced their former American guards. They placed a wreath at the American Legion Memorial, honoring the soldiers who had fought against them. Speaking for the group, a man named Fritz Zimmermann said, "We came here as enemies, believing in a mad ideology. We leave today as friends, understanding that a democracy's chaos is its strength, and that a nation's true power is measured not by its ability to destroy, but by its capacity to forgive." The story of the German POWs in America is more than a historical curiosity. It is a profound lesson in the nature of power. It demonstrates that a nation's most potent weapon is not its arsenal, but its ideals. America won the silent war not by forcing its enemies to change, but by showing them a world so compelling, so prosperous, and so fundamentally decent that they chose to change themselves. They came expecting to find a decadent, divided nation, and instead discovered a society so confident that it could afford mercy, so strong that it had no need for hate. The victory was not won through propaganda, but through reality. The prisoners saw democracy work, messily and imperfectly. They saw a multiracial society struggle, yet endure. They saw a nation sacrifice for war, while fiercely protecting the freedoms that made life worth living. They witnessed firsthand that the greatest antidote to totalitarianism is not a rival ideology, but the simple, undeniable evidence of a better life. And this brings us to a crucial question for our own turbulent times. The story of Camp Hearn reveals the incredible power of soft power, of winning hearts and minds instead of just destroying bodies. Do you believe the lessons from this chapter of World War II are still relevant today? In a world of renewed conflicts and clashing ideologies, is compassion still a viable weapon? Or was this unique moment in history a romantic exception to the brutal rules of war? Share your thoughts in the comments below.